The Conference of the Friends of International Arbitration and Peace, held at Manchester on the 27th and 28th of January 1853, was both a national event and one that showcased Manchester's distinctively business-like approach to international issues. Chaired by the head of the recently triumphant Anti-Corn Law League, George Wilson, and with a keynote address from that league's principal orator, Richard Cobden, it attracted considerable attention, but it failed in its effort to prevent progressive opinion turning away from the commitment to peace it had apparently been making in the late 1840s and early 1850s, and towards the crusading enthusiasm that was to carry Britain into the Crimean War 14 months later. This failure meant that the Manchester Peace Conference of January 1853 is now largely forgotten. Nonetheless, it marked a significant moment in the history of British peace activism, representing an acceptance that the peace movement was a coalition of absolutists and reformists, and that neither could make progress without the other. Today, I shall therefore place the Manchester Conference of January 1853 in the context of British peace activism up to that point. In doing so, I shall pick up on the from local to global theme, which is an interesting one for a conference about peace activism. The global bit is obvious. After all, peace movements have almost always been globally focused. They've offered a dissenting approach to the way international relations have almost always been conducted. When conducting their relationships with other countries, the rulers of states have normally been realists who maintain strong defences so that potential aggressors are not tempted by easy pickings. In other words, almost all governments have believed that a truce among armed and watchful states is the best the international system can hope for. But around the time of the French Revolution, a new movement emerged with a more idealistic view of international relations. This movement began to argue that peace of a more profound and permanent kind was in fact achievable, because sooner or later war could be abolished. In this way, a debate developed between realist supporters of orthodox defence policy and idealistic peace activists about how best to conduct international relations. Yet where you stand in this long-standing debate has always in part depended on where you sit, which is where the local comes in. By this I mean the belief in the achievability of true and lasting peace and in the abolishability of war has come more easily in some geographical and political locations than in others. In countries vulnerable to invasion, governments propounding the realist approach to international relations have met very few challenges from their citizens. So, in much of continental Europe, with its easily crossable land borders and with potential invaders located on several fronts, the need for strong national defences has been overwhelmingly accepted by the public. Much of continental Europe thus tolerated that extraordinary governmental imposition on the citizenry, military conscription. Similarly accepted in those vulnerable countries was the doctrine of realpolitik, according to which one's enemy's enemy becomes one's friend. But in Britain, protected from continental Europe by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, there was, particularly before the military aeroplane, sufficient security for a more idealistic take on international relations to develop. Britons did not need to concentrate full-time on national defence. Except in their intermittent defence panics, they could contemplate the arbitration of international disputes and even the reduction of their armaments. But, because the channel is narrow and because Britain also developed a far-flung empire, Britain never experienced the almost complete sense of security enjoyed by, most notably, the United States prior to the intercontinental ballistic missile. In its era of near total security, the United States could, in its introspective moods, opt out of international relations almost completely. American anti-war sentiment could, and indeed frequently did, express itself merely as isolationism rather than as peace activism. In other words, American progressives often washed their hands of the international system rather than working to reform it. Few of their British counterparts, by contrast, believed they had the option of isolationism. They took the view that if a war broke out in Europe or near a British colonial possession, Britain risked being drawn in. Many British progressives therefore worked actively to abolish war. Britain's geographical position of semi-detachment thus gave it sufficient security to look beyond realpolitik yet not so much security that isolationism distracted it away from reforming the international system. How, if at all, did Manchester's geographical position cause its approach to international relations to differ from that of the country as a whole, and in particular that of London? Perhaps it's significant that it was just after he moved northwest to Lancashire that Richard Cobden began criticising the argument traditionally favoured by British governments that the country had to concern itself with the balance of power in Europe. In Manchester, Europe must have seemed even farther away than it did in the south. But local attitudes to international relations are influenced not only by where one sits geographically, they are also influenced by the political culture in which one finds oneself. The values of Catholic, Lutheran or Orthodox countries were not conducive to individualistic moral dissent. Authoritarian, protectionist and conscriptionist cultures, such as those of Prussia and Austria-Hungary, were more favourable to the glorification of war, even of an aggressive kind, than they were to the condemnation of war. The principal challenge to the militaristic culture in such states came not from a progressive bourgeoisie like that of Manchester, but from Marxist or anarchist movements created by a socially alienated working class. By contrast, Britain developed a liberal, Protestant, commercial culture that entrenched support for free speech, voluntarism and free trade among much of the bourgeoisie, that integrated the labour movement into national life, and that legitimated what A.J.P. Taylor called trouble-making criticism of the government's foreign and defence policies. Put at its simplest, it is the liberal strand within a political culture that produces a strong peace movement. And during the 19th century, a strong liberal party emerged in Britain to challenge the conservatism of the traditional political elite. However, as the example of the United States illustrates, unchecked liberalism can overbalance into crusading. Unlike Europe, America never had a traditional feudal or aristocratic elite to inject a realist view of international relations into its public life. The United States had, right from its War of Independence, been a liberal political project, and the Puritan streak in its culture made it strongly liberal moralist. After it industrialized rapidly in the late 19th century and began to flex its great power muscles, it sometimes focused less on the evil of war than on the evil of other regimes. Thus, Spain's mistreatment of its subjects in Cuba outraged many American progressives, and their outrage pushed the country into the Spanish-American War of 1898. Although the crusading impulse was not unknown in Britain, as the Crimean War showed, it faced stronger political cultural checks than in the United States. The realist viewpoint adopted by most British conservatives was normally sceptical of crusading. Britain's political culture was one in which liberal idealism was tempered by conservative realism, and so can be described as semi-liberal. It provided a congenial climate for peace activism. How did Manchester's culture differ from that of Britain generally? As we shall see, it shared the provincial suspicion towards the capital city that was to cause some tension within the British peace movement during the 1830s and 1840s. But the Mancunian approach to the peace question was always more self-consciously moderate and commercial, and therefore more hard-headed and materialist, than that of provincials in other cities. We've thus noted that Britain had a semi-detached geographical position and a semi-liberal political culture, which were particularly favourable to peace activism. Britain was therefore the first country to mount a recognisably modern peace campaign. This took place in the mid-1790s in protest against the country's involvement in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of 1793 to 1815. Its participants were described as the Friends of Peace, although they decided not to form peace associations until the conflict ended. Because America's War of 1812 ended before Britain's French War, the world's first peace associations were established in New York and Massachusetts in 1815. Britain's first peace associations didn't appear until the following year, 1816, when two were established in London. But Britain developed the world's strongest peace movement over the next decades. The Peace Society, that established itself in London in June 1816, though always modest in size, proved itself the most enduring and vocal national peace association of its time. To understand the Manchester Peace Conference of January 1853, we must understand the structural tensions within the peace movement which the conference helped to resolve. From the outset, the peace movement consisted of two distinct wings, absolutist and reformist. Absolutists, who though vocal were very few in number, believed that military force could and should immediately be renounced as unjustifiable under any conditions. War would thus be abolished by mass conscientious objection. Prior to the invention of the word pacifism, which didn't happen until 1901, absolutists were often described as non-resistors because they opposed armed resistance to aggression. Absolutist ideas originated in sectarian Christianity. Rejection of military service was a byproduct of a broader rejection by certain sects of an ungodly society. At first, therefore, sectarians such as Quakers, who declared themselves non-resistors in January 1661, implied that their rejection of militia service was not something that all Christians were bound to do. It was binding only on those with a higher spiritual calling that defined their sect. But as the Quakers, while still refusing to serve in the militia, prospered and participated in various philanthropic activities, they established connections with mainstream society and mainstream religion. Through contact with Quakers, the idea developed that non-resistance might not be merely their particular and peculiar interpretation of Christianity, but one that all professing that faith should adopt. A sign that Britain was generating the first recognised modern peace campaign was the publication in London in the years 1796 to 8 of the first absolutist tracts written by non-Quakers and aimed at Christians of any denomination, including the established church. It's thus in those years that pacifism, in the sense in which the word is used today, first appeared. It has always been the viewpoint of a very tiny minority, though historically that tiny minority has been larger in Britain than in other countries. The other wing of the peace movement has consisted of reformists who have always outnumbered the absolutists by some distance. Reformists have been less controversial and assertive than the absolutists because they do not refuse to fight. They believe that war will be abolished not by mass conscientious objection, but by political reforms either to the structure of the international system or to the states constituting that system. In the 1790s, radical writers such as Thomas Paine and William Godwin argued that war would be abolished by republican government. In other words, by bringing monarchies and aristocracies, which both revelled in war, under the control of the people, who were assumed not to want to do military service. In the early 19th century, liberals such as Richard Cobden began arguing that free trade would make the international system more harmonious and ultimately peaceful. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, socialists began arguing that war was caused by capitalism and imperialism and would therefore be abolished by a revolutionary transformation of the economic and social order. Later, feminists blamed war on patriarchy, the ending of which would entrench peace. There have in fact been almost as many war-abolishing reforms proposed as there have been progressive political ideologies. But until those reforms take effect, the reformist wing of the peace movement argues that military force can still be justified, provided it is not used in an aggressive or reactionary way. Thus, for example, socialists should defend progressive regimes, but not fight to retain unjustly acquired colonies. One problem with the reformist variety of peace activism has been the lack of a snappy label to identify it. In the 19th century, various circumlocutions were used to distinguish a reformist from an absolutist. Peace advocate of defensive war, employed by the American pacifist Elihu Burritt, was one of the most succinct. When the word pacifism began to be used from 1901, it applied mainly to reformists because they were the most numerous element within the peace movement at the time, particularly in continental Europe where the word was coined. But as pacifism became increasingly to be applied to absolutists, there has been no obvious label for reformists. In the 1950s, the celebrated historian A.J.P. Taylor suggested the term pacificist to describe those who were pacific in their attitudes without going as far as pacifism in the absolute sense. In my own work, I've used pacificist to describe reformists. Now, the relationship between absolutists or pacifists on the one hand and reformists or pacificists on the other has always been crucial to the dynamics of the British peace movement and was a central issue at the 1853 Manchester Peace Conference. All the earliest peace associations, those established in New York and Massachusetts during 1815 and in London during 1816, debated hard as to whether their basis should be exclusively absolutist, exclusively reformist, or some combination of the two. Being exclusively absolutist greatly constrained the peace association's potential size by restricting membership to the exiguous number of non-resistors, but it attracted funding from sects such as the Quakers and Mennonites, whose virtuous styles of life caused them to grow rich and inclined them to use that prosperity for good works rather than self-gratification. Setting up an association on a reformist basis produced a larger membership, because reformism is a less exacting creed, but it was a less dedicated membership and contained people who might endorse certain wars as legitimately defensive, always a problem for a self-styled peace association. The world's first such body, the New York Peace Society of August 1815, initially insisted on absolutism. Reformists were not allowed to join. The Massachusetts Peace Society of December 1815 recruited absolutists and reformists on an equal basis. Pacifists and pacificists were as welcome as each other, and were given the same status. Britain's first peace association, the short-lived Society for Abolishing War, formed in March 1816, deliberately excluded absolutists because it saw them as unworldly dreamers whose pacifism might actually encourage aggression, and sought to recruit instead practically minded radicals working to control the warlike urges of the aristocratic elite. Britain's second peace association, the Society for the Promotion of Permanent and Universal Peace of June 1816, which almost immediately became known for short as the Peace Society, and overseas as the London Peace Society, came up with a fourth formula. The Peace Society insisted that its committee members be absolutists, but allowed reformists to join as ordinary members in the hope that they would eventually be influenced to adopt the committee's higher ground or grand principle of non-resistance. This top-tier absolutism was a clever compromise, which is why, incidentally, the struggling New York Peace Society switched to it in 1818. The fact that the committee was exclusively absolutist helped to bring in both Quaker money and a hard core of committed supporters who saw the London Peace Society through its moments of adversity. In particular, only absolutists could be guaranteed to remain immune from panics over national defence. But the fact that the ordinary membership would include reformists allowed the Peace Society to recruit a sufficient membership of non-absolutists to give it some slight political influence. The most famous of these non-absolutist members was the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who in 1789 had made the first recorded suggestion that a peace association, or as he called it, a philharmonic society, be founded. The Peace Society's top-tier pacifism worked reasonably well. It ensured the Quaker funding that was vital to its survival, whilst also attracting a sufficient reformist membership to make sure that the various non-absolutist associations that were created as rivals to the Peace Society did not steal its thunder. So by the time of the 1853 Manchester Peace Conference, the British peace movement had been institutionalised under the leadership of the Peace Society for 36 years. During that time, it had gone through 4 distinct phases, which need to be outlined in order to make sense of the Manchester event. Phase 1 was 1816 to 1831, or 1830. During these years, the infant Peace Society was not only Britain's only peace association, it was quietist and did little more than publish certain carefully vetted tracts and a magazine, the Herald of Peace. The Peace Society's foundation occurred at a time when Britain was still engulfed in the politically repressive aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. It was therefore not an easy time to establish a new association of extreme opinions that might be thought to be politically subversive. The Peace Society began therefore by playing up its religiosity. Its committee consisted of devout Christians. In trying to work out the denominational affiliations of these almost entirely obscure individuals, I noticed that Quakers seemed always to constitute half of that committee, and never more than half. I concluded this must have been a deliberate restriction to avoid the Peace Society being viewed as a front organisation for the Society of Friends, and to emphasise that it had supporters in many Christian denominations, including even the Church of England. To further underline its religious basis, it downplayed the many secular arguments which could be used against war. Its cruelty, its waste, its diversion of productive humans into often squalid military lives. It continually referred to the higher ground on which alone its rejection of war was based, Christianity. The Peace Society also played up its apolitical nature. It presented itself as involved in a very long-term and gradual process of educating Christians into the true reading of their faith in respect of war. It did not support reformist ideas for war prevention, such as the codification of international law, even though Bentham was calling for this. Nor did the Peace Society make any practical claims for its own absolutist faith, of the kind that later generations of pacifists would make when, particularly under Gandhi's influence, they claimed that non-violent resistance was superior to military resistance as a tactic for throwing opponents off balance. The nearest the Peace Society came to claiming political efficacy for its point of view was the occasional hint by one of its more evangelically minded members that a truly Christian and therefore non-resistant nation would receive particular protection from divine providence. Phase 2 was from beginning of the 1830s to the mid-1840s, 1845. During these years, Britain's political climate began to liberalise. New organisations joined the campaign for peace, and the Peace Society to some extent adapted. The Whigs returned to government in 1830, and their Great Reform Act 2 years later was the major symptom of and stimulus to this political liberalisation. Political change was matched by moral reform movements. 1830 saw the launch, for example, of temperance societies, which soon spawned an absolutist offshoot, the teetotal movement, which pioneered the signed pledge as a campaigning tactic that peace activists rapidly copied. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and the ripples began to reach Britain from William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist movement in the United States, which espoused not just pacifism, but an anarchist rejection of the entire American political system on the grounds it was morally tainted by slavery. In 1840, Garrison came to London to attend an anti-slavery meeting, which is usually regarded as the first international conference of reformers. Linked closely to moral reform were certain economic and political campaigns. 1838 saw the launch of the Anti-Corn Law League, in which Cobden made his name and which did much to advance the liberal pacifist view that the best way to prevent war is to bind states together with free trade. It also brought Manchester to the forefront of reform politics. Also in 1838, the Chartist movement appeared to campaign for manhood suffrage. It was an ally of the Peace Society in that it opposed any revival of the militia, but it had a physical force wing of which the Peace Society understandably disapproved. Indeed, Peace Society lecturers tried to convert all Chartists to the moral force approach, which some of them already supported. Indeed, although historians of Chartism have failed to notice this fact, the Newport Uprising of 1839 may have failed because some of the Welsh Chartists expected to join it and to bring artillery with them failed to show up after Peace Society lecturers had worked on them. Just conceivably, the Peace Society thereby helped to delay Britain's democratisation. Faced with this growing activism after 1832, the Peace Society, which had grown into a body of about 1,500 annual subscribers, rapidly developed from being the quietest religious body that avoided political pronouncements into being a pressure group that sent lecturers around the country and issued leaflets commenting on topical international issues. In 1837, the Herald of Peace backed Mexico against the United States at the time of the latter's grab for Texas. In 1840, the Peace Society petitioned Parliament for the first time and turned its annual meeting into a public event. In 1843, imitating the anti-slavery movement, it organised the General Peace Convention in London, the first international peace congress. The Peace Society also came out against Britain's death penalty on the grounds that pacifists could never support the taking of human life. And it began to endorse liberal ideas for codifying international law and and settling disputes between states through a judicial process, even though a legalistic approach of this kind logically raised the question of whether international law should be enforced in the same way as domestic law was. But this new pressure group activism on the part of the Peace Society in London was insufficient to satisfy some peace activists. The new moral reform, economic and political movements were disproportionately provincial in their origins and dynamism. For example, Preston was the home of the Teetotal Pledge, and for a while was also particularly receptive to Garrisonian anarcho-pacifism. Dublin and Newcastle also had a disproportionately strong Garrisonian minority. Distrust of London's rather smug philanthropic establishment became rife among provincial progressives. The Peace Society, despite its conversion to pressure group campaigning, was accused of metropolitan inactivity. The Birmingham Quaker Joseph Sturge became the leader of a self-consciously provincial moral radicalism intended to shame its London-based counterparts, such as the Committee of London Peace Society. Sturge, a wealthy grain importer who devoted his life to philanthropic campaigning, was one of the truly good and great men of 19th century Britain who deserves to be much better known. He was active in the causes of anti-slavery, free trade and moral force Chartism, as well as that of peace. Thank you very much. Joseph Sturge was generous to a fault, his only real failing being a short-tempered intolerance of those who did not think the same as him, though he soon forgave and forgot. Thanks in large part to Joseph Sturge, though also to the Garrisonian movement, attempts were made in 1842-3 to launch a British Peace Association as a more dynamic, more provincially located, more morally intense, and more truly national alternative to the Peace Society. Had the London Committee of the Peace Society not bestirred itself to mount the General Peace Convention of 1843, this alternative might not just have been talked about, but actually created. As it was, Joseph Sturge gradually softened his anti-metropolitan feeling and became reconciled with the Peace Society. This was in part because he found himself outflanked in his moral radicalism by both Garrisonians, whose anarcho-pacifism was even more absolutist than his own, and by the physical force wing of Chartism, of which as a non-resistor he morally disapproved. So during the second phase of the British peace movement, the years 1832 to 1845, free traders, moral radicals, Garrisonians and moral force Chartists formed an often difficult alliance with a peace society that was itself taking up pressure group activity for the first time. This increased diversity and activism in the cause of war prevention accounts for the entry into English usage during the first half of the 1840s of the term peace movement. Phase 3 of British peace activity proved to be its 19th century heyday, the years 1846 to 1851. A rumour of 1846 that Peel's Conservative government proposed to revive the militia produced strong protest not only from the Peace Society, free traders and Chartists, but from artisans generally. That same government's repeal of the Corn Laws, also in 1846, showed the peace movement that progressive campaigning could change public policy. And the decision also freed Cobden for an imminent shift from the free trade to the peace movement. But the most effective mobiliser of artisan anti-militia sentiment was a visitor from Connecticut, Elihu Burritt, the charismatic, multilingual, learned blacksmith who launched his League of Universal Brotherhood in 1846. This was an organisation catering mainly for artisans that opposed not only military service, militia service and slavery, but also required a teetotal type pledge in favour of pacifism. The League of Universal Brotherhood eventually claimed 10,000 pledged signatories, making it the first mass peace association. It also, somewhat incongruously, developed a support network of mainly middle-class women called Olive Leaf Circles, a network that has some claim to be the first women's peace movement. The League of Universal Brotherhood, the Chartists, and other anti-militia groups did much to cause the government to back down on the militia issue in 1847, a rare instance in which peace activism contributed to a change in government policy. The anti-militia struggle having been won, the ever-innovative Elihu Burritt turned his attention in 1848 to staging the first ever international peace meeting on the continent of Europe. After revolution in Paris ruled that city out, Burritt switched his venue to Brussels, where a peace congress was held in September 1848. The success of that venture led to the creation in Britain of a Peace Congress Committee to plan future such events. It was technically a joint venture between the Peace Society and the League of Universal Brotherhood, but its real utility was as a vehicle for non-absolutists who wished to participate in peace activism without being implicated in the doctrine of non-resistance. The most prominent of these was Richard Cobden. After the success of his campaign against agricultural protection in 1846, when the Corn Laws were repealed, Cobden had, in 1847-8, taken up the cause of financial reform. In order to prevent the government compensating for the loss of tariff revenue by putting up direct taxation, he urged a reduction in government expenditure instead. This led him to identify armaments as an area in which retrenchment could most easily be made, and to reduce any risks attached to armament reduction, arbitration treaties should be signed with other states so that any disputes could be settled peaceably. This sequence of reasoning in effect turned Cobden into a peace campaigner, more or less full-time, with effect from the beginning of 1849. His relationship to the Peace Society thus became a complex one. Cobden was not himself a pacifist, though there is some evidence that he had been in his youth. He also knew, both as a seasoned national campaigner and as a close colleague of Mancunian notables such as George Wilson, that in British politics a hard-headed, business-friendly approach played better than a utopian, sentimental one. But he was further aware that launching an explicitly reformist or pacifist association independent of the Peace Society, though the logical thing for a non-absolutist peace activist to do, would be difficult. In 1847, an association of just this type, the Peace of Nations Society, had been set up by former members of the Peace Society who turned against the non-resisting approach of its top tier. But the Peace of Nations Society had made little impact and was soon to fade away. Cobden also understood that the Peace Congress Committee was a poor substitute for such a reformist or pacifist association. The Peace Congress Committee was merely a device for enabling the Peace Society to cooperate with non-pacifists like him without embarrassing its absolutist paymasters. The Peace Congress Committee had no substance other than that provided for it by the Peace Society, since the League of Universal Brotherhood was crumbling rapidly after Burritt turned his attention to European congresses. Yet Cobden was nervous that his parliamentary motions on disarmament and arbitration would flop completely without extra parliamentary support. Only the Peace Society could deliver this, both via the metropolitan network which its London committee represented, and the even stronger provincial network which his friend Joseph Sturge still largely commanded. So during 1848-9, Cobden moved close to the Peace Society, and in particular to its impressive new secretary, the Congregationalist minister Henry Richard. Technically, Cobden's relations were with the Peace Congress Committee, which he officially joined in 1850, rather than with the Peace Society. Although Cobden did not attend the Brussels Peace Congress of September 1848, he sent a widely reported message of support. And he played a leading role at the next 3 international congresses, which Burritt organised at Paris in August 1849, at Frankfurt in August 1850, and, piggybacking on the success of the Great Exhibition, in London in July 1851. By the end of the London Peace Congress, peace feeling had reached its 19th century peak. The optimistic mood of that moment was nostalgically recalled a decade later by Henry Richard of the Peace Society. Quote, "There seemed then a prospect not indeed of a new millennium, but of a steady increase of mutual respect and goodwill among nations, and of the growth of a public opinion under the pressure of which governments might be obliged to seek for some more rational means of settling their differences than by recourse to the sword, and some less ruinous methods of preserving peace than by an insane rivalry in armaments. But this mood was soon to change, as the peace movement entered phase 4, a phase of retreat that lasted from the autumn of 1851 into the mid-1860s. The visit of the Hungarian nationalist leader Lajos Kossuth to Britain in October and November 1851 stimulated enormous public enthusiasm and demands, including predominantly from progressive opinion, for a crusade against Russia, because Russia the previous year had suppressed Kossuth's nationalist uprising against the Habsburgs. Even Cobden appeared on a public platform with Kossuth and came close to compromising his peace message in so doing. Cobden quarrelled with the Committee of the Peace Society when it issued a statement signed by Joseph Sturge and Henry Richard, stating that the Hungarians should have practiced non-resistance in the face of the Russian intervention. Cobden feared that having drawn close to the Peace Society via the Peace Congress Committee, he would be tainted by the Peace Society's support for non-resistance in a context in which that policy was more unpopular than ever, given the hatred of Russia that had developed among British progressives. On top of the crusading enthusiasm sparked by Kossuth's visit, a coup in France in December 1851 by Louis Napoleon triggered an invasion scare, and a decision in 1852 by the British government to revive the militia, although in the end voluntary recruitment sufficed and no militia ballot was held. The Manchester Peace Conference of January 1853 was thus part of a rearguard action against the anti-Russian and anti-French sentiment that was sweeping the country. Plans for a 5th European Peace Congress at Amsterdam in the summer of 1852 had been shelved because of the invasion crisis, and a British National Conference was proposed instead. Manchester was an obvious location. It was a progressive city, yet a hard-headed one. When a town meeting had been called there in June 1851 in support of Cobden's arms reduction resolution, that meeting explicitly gave, quote, those who were in favour of the reduction of armaments on financial grounds precedence over those who on moral grounds prefer arbitration, in the words of the Manchester Examiner. The city's reputation for constituting the realist wing of British progressivism meant that Mancunian support for the anti-crusading and anti-militia cause would carry considerable weight with progressive opinion. But such support couldn't be taken for granted. In particular, some Manchester notables had felt marginalised by the London Peace Congress. Crucially, however, George Wilson had been present in London, and in May 1852 he also attended the annual meeting of the Manchester branch, or auxiliary, of the Peace Society. In 1852, thanks largely to George Wilson, discussion of a Manchester conference began. Joseph Sturge was actively involved, while Cobden waited somewhat nervously in the wings. The Mancunians, who announced their initiative in October 1852, insisted that the conference be described as being for the Friends of International Arbitration and Peace. International arbitration sounding a more business-like notion than an unvarnished aspiration for peace. The local organisers stressed the commercial case for peace more than the moral one, and in dealing with the latter, they concentrated on the claims of, quote, humanity and common sense, as they put it, rather than on those of religion. For a long time, they refused to have disarmament or the size of European standing armies discussed, for fear of seeming utopian. They also played up their conference's autonomous provincial provenance. Thus, although the Peace Society, which like Richard Cobden was extremely nervous that the Manchester Conference would fail, and so sent one of its experienced London-based agents, William Stokes, north to help make practical arrangements, Joseph Sturge acknowledged that because Stokes' official connection with the Peace Society is so well known, the more he is kept out of sight, the better. When on the 27th and 28th of January 1853 the Manchester Conference finally took place, it was an impressive spectacle. The 1,000-seater Call Exchange was well filled, according to newspaper reports, with 500 official delegates present, plus several hundred visitors, a good proportion of them women, and all of them British. Adding to the appeal of the occasion were George Wilson's chairmanship and John Bright's first appearance at the Peace Conference. Despite, or perhaps because of, his Quakerism, Bright had previously stayed aloof from the peace movement and concentrated instead on the suffrage issue. The conference condemned the militia bill and passed 2 resolutions in favour of disarmament and other resolutions in favour of non-intervention, arbitration treaties, and the spreading through education of Pacific principles. In his speech, Cobden chose to concentrate on Britain's strange predilection for irrational defence panics, as he had done in a pamphlet he had just issued, called 1793 and 1853, which sold well among those attending the conference. From a peace movement point of view, the most interesting aspect of the conference was that it chose to highlight what the new nonconformist newspaper called a new coalition, the combined movement of peace and free trade. In other words, rather than fudging the fact that the peace movement consisted of 2 wings, absolutist and reformist, as every previous peace congress had, it drew attention to the fact and attempted to celebrate it. George Wilson made clear that though he did not share the Peace Society's views on what he called the abstract merits of aggressive or defensive war, he praised the Peace Society for working with everyone who sought by temperate and proper means to challenge that system of rule of which they all complained. Wilson also insisted that Peace Society had some special claims on the support of financial reformers, and even more so on that of free traders. Likewise, Cobden praised those of the Peace Society who took cognizance not just of the pounds, shillings and pence question, but the question of physical suffering, but on the eternal issues. And Cobden insisted that the problem of war could not be tackled without such absolutist idealists. For his part, Joseph Sturge reassured his fellow absolutists that they made not the slightest compromise of principle by taking the ground the Peace Congress Committee did, as distinct from that of their own Peace Society. In a concluding public rally, symbolically held in the Free Trade Hall, Cobden emphasised that he personally had no connection with the Peace Society and had started working with it only after the Peace Congress Committee was launched, but once again defended the appropriateness of reformists like himself working in cooperation with absolutists despite the latter's belief in non-resistance, in thus not only admitting but emphasising its diversity. The Manchester Conference marked the coming to maturity of the British peace movement. But although a success in its own terms and receiving much press coverage, the conference was widely condemned, including by a placard that appeared widely around Manchester, "Beware the peace humbug." With a few provincial exceptions, Britain's newspapers were hostile. The attempt of the Peace Society to follow up the Manchester Conference by sending its secretary Henry Richard up north soon petered out. The French invasion scare subsided, but only because the Eastern question erupted, turning France into an ally against Russia. Another national peace conference was held on this issue at Edinburgh in October 1853, with Cobden and Bright both present. A few months later, Joseph Sturge set off on his personal diplomatic mission to the Tsar to try to preserve peace, though he did so on behalf of the Quakers, not the Peace Society. The Crimean War began amid remarkable public enthusiasm, in which a number of pacificists joined, presenting the defence of Turkey against Russia as a pacific action. Cobden disagreed, but considered the protest futile. John Bright, however, courageously condemned the war. The Peace Society generally held to its absolutist line, and reformists eventually launched a Stop the War League. For the first time in history, A pre-existing, institutionalised peace movement opposed a war in which its own country was involved. That it did so in full knowledge that absolutist and reformist associations were making complementary contributions to this difficult task was in part the achievement of the now almost forgotten Manchester Peace Conference of the 27th and 28th January 1853.